Hello, everyone. I'm Keith Jansa, the Executive Director of the CIO Strategy Council. I'm pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's content presented by the Council in collaboration with Forward 50. Our discussions this afternoon will have a particular focus on public, private, and not-for-profit collaboration on some of the most highly rated and pressing digital policy areas. I'd like to introduce you to the Council's co-chairs, Mark Briard and Jim Basili, to help us kick off this afternoon session. Mark.
Thanks, Keith. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here at Forward 50. I'm also excited to see so many of you joining us from across Canada and from around the world. I'd like to begin by commending Keith and his team for all the great work that has been done by the Council over the past several months. This has really been a culmination of a lot of work by a lot of people. This is a very important time. COVID-19 has really accelerated our digital transformation, and our digital capabilities are now more than ever mission critical. A lot of work is currently underway to move Canada towards a digital-first government, and as we transition to a truly digital society, we will need to reposition ourselves as a strong nation that protects and promotes domestic innovation and information technology, all while remaining true to our core Canadian values. One of the quintessential values lies in the premium we place on collaboration. So in continuing to push Canada's digital agenda forward, we know that our efforts will be bolstered by strong relationships we have forged with the provinces and territories, international partners, as well as the private sector. This is one of the core values of the CIO Strategy Council. As leaders in the digital space, now more than ever, it is important for us to come together and identify opportunities for collaboration as we work towards future-proofing Canada's digital enablement and unlocking the benefits for all Canadians. Earlier this week, Minister Murray chaired an international meeting on digital government, where we discussed resiliency and acceleration of digital government and the digital world. These themes are reflected in the CIO Strategy Council National Blueprint for Digital Enablement, as well as its annual report. We strongly believe that driving strategic leadership through collective action, enabled through standards development, will be key to ensuring continued competitiveness for Canada. In doing so, it is essential for us to get the fundamentals right. As Jim always says, you have to get it tight before you get loose. This includes a renewed focus on digital identity, data sharing, domestic procurement, and defense of our digital infrastructure. Canada is well placed to invest in its own digital identity system, one that is robust and trusted. The drive to become a digital identity nation has only become more urgent due to recent times. As we emerge from the pandemic, it will be critical for us to build a strong, integrated digital ecosystem while remaining focused on maximizing Canadian economic benefit and promoting innovative Canadian companies. The acceleration of Canada's post-COVID economic recovery will further be driven through effective and secure data sharing mechanisms between organizations and across all sectors for the Canadian economy. Finally, it should be emphasized that rapid digital transformation will inject new risks into the cyber landscape that cannot be ignored. So it will be critical for us to have a renewed focus on establishing cyber resilience and defending our digital infrastructure through the adoption of cyber-secure devices and systems. The challenges of our era demand audacious solutions. Together, let's continue this momentum as we push Canada's digital agenda forward and continue to harness the power of innovation to position our country to compete in a post-pandemic world. I'd now be interested in hearing your thoughts, Jim, on the importance of public and private sector collaboration in a data-driven economy.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon. I'm Jim Balsley, founder and co-chair of the CIO Strategy Council, and I'm pleased to be joining you today with my fellow co-chair and Canada's acting CIO, Mark Briard. While this global pandemic has accelerated the movement to all digital, the all-Canadian leadership of Forward 50 is helping critical stakeholders find solutions in the areas of technology, policymaking, innovation, and ethics. There's never been a better time to accelerate strategies for digital government and public-private sector collaboration. I applaud Forward 50 for convening this discussion, and I'm confident your participation in the sessions today will both enlighten and educate you on the necessary steps for a better digital future. It's helpful to first take a look in the rearview mirror and consider how the world has changed over the past few decades. The digital transformation over the past 30 years has created a new kind of economy in which the basis of wealth and power is derived from control of data and ownership of valuable intellectual property. This transformation is creating a new kind of social and political space in which both the public and private spheres are technologically reshaped. IP and data are now the world's most valuable business and national security assets. In 1976, 16% of the value of the S&P 500 was intangibles. Today, intangibles comprise over 90% of the S&P 500's $27 trillion total value. The nature of the digital transformation is not only about technology. It impacts our online and offline lives. It shapes our values, prosperity, health, and security. It also has significant implications on privacy and the integrity of democratic processes and institutions. This is why I argue that data governance is the most important public policy issue of our time. Whoever controls the data controls who and what interacts with it, making it essential to look at data governance in an integrated way. Neglecting to govern our data allows for the inappropriate exploitation of it, undermining our ability to address the public policy challenges we face. A contemporary data strategy also prioritizes the creation of standards. Technology standards might seem obscure, but they are the crucial aspect of a new and intensifying geopolitical battleground. As the Financial Times recently noted, the Cold War was dominated by a race to build the most nuclear weapons, but in our digitally driven age, control over the most important industries of today is played out through a struggle to control standards. Standards reflect the priorities and goals of those who set them, from the creators of the IP who embed their interests within them, to policymakers who build them into policy frameworks. In my 20 years of growing research in motion from an idea into a global business with 20 billion in sales, I worked with hundreds of global technology leaders from the top public and private organizations. I learned that the most strategic and successful technology leaders were the ones setting the standards. The importance of coordinated public policy in the area of digital government cannot be overstated. The decisions that we make today will affect the way our countries live and interact with technology for many generations to come. By collaborating as a national and international community, we have an opportunity to shape emerging technologies for both new innovations and, crucially, for the public good. I would now like to call on Keith to introduce our first panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That's a great introduction by both Mark and Jim, and some of the, like I said, the highly rated policy issues of our time and the need for public, private, and not-for-profit collaboration. I'm pleased to introduce our first of four esteemed panels this afternoon. I'm joined alongside Chantal Guy, the CEO of Standards Council of Canada, Dr. Daniel Araya, Senior Partner at the World Legal Summit, and Joni Brennan, President of the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada. Welcome. To kick things off, a question to the three of you. How are the public, private, and non-profit sectors in a position to advance global cooperation in Canada and around the world? Let's start with Joni, and we'll go to Chantal and then Daniel to close off.
Yeah, thanks so much for that great question, and thanks for the invitation for this panel today on this very important topic. I think that we, as Canada, are in a fantastic position. We do have collaboration as one of our core principles, based off of confederation and our governance. So I would say that we're a very cooperative region to begin with. We see a lot of cooperation in Canada already from major institutions like the financial sector, for example. And there's a lot that we can build on with the different technology collaborations, the policy-focused collaborations, and especially in the place where public and private meet, which is so important in terms of moving the space forward around data governance in a way that respects and works for all Canadians.
Chantal, key points there with data governance being highlighted by Joni. What are your thoughts around advancing digital cooperation in Canada and around the world?
I firmly believe that by participating in standards development, that's very important. Jim has alluded to do this, to that. We have to do it here in Canada, but as well as at the international standardization forums of ISO and IEC. And why do we need to do this? Because cooperation between the public, the private, and the non-for-profit sectors is actually the cornerstone of standards development and adoption, and it will advance digital cooperation in Canada and around the world. And we, the Standards Council of Canada, we are here to ensure that our standardization system is very strong and agile, and it continues to meet the needs of Canadians, which are greatly changing through this digital transformation, and that importantly, our voice and values are heard at the international standardization forums. We strongly believe that the digital charter that has been issued in 2019 contains important principles. It speaks to a strong foundation of trust and transparency between citizen, companies, and government, and there is no trust nor transparency without standards. So we, again, believe that it's very important that we are involved, that Canadians are involved in standards development here in Canada, but also at the international level. There's great opportunities already through the CIO Strategy Council, through CSA, who's another standard development organizations, and many others. And at the international level, there's been great work done by Canadians under the auspices of ISO and IEC Subcommittee 42. And we think that it's important that we work on topics such as trustworthiness, and we're leading this conversation at the international level, and more recently, the development of an AI management system, again, led by Canadians at the international level.
That's great. And Daniel, your perspective here, when it comes to bringing together different sectors of the economy, public, private, nonprofit, how do we go about positioning ourselves to advance digital cooperation here at home and abroad?
Well, it's a big question. I don't think it's something you can answer in a simple way. I mean, what we're seeing in the world is a bifurcation of the geopolitical superstructure. So we're seeing a Chinese region, a European region, an American region. Each of them have different standards, it looks like. They have different goals and ambitions. And I think that the populist waves that we're seeing now are reflective of a disintegration to a certain degree of the institutions that we have in place and have had in place since World War II. So the short answer would be that we're going to need new institutions for sure at every level that are complementary to government, that enable a broad discussion across public, private, NGOs, academic, and other organizations. And I think, the truth is that I don't think we know how to do this effectively yet. And I think this is going to take time to work out. I think there's going to be a lot of mistakes made. At the World Legal Summit, where I am, we're trying to constantly negotiate between the private sector, the market, and its interest in innovation, and then the interest of citizens or users in sovereignty and privacy. I mean, those two ambitions are at odds and causing friction. And so we're going to need a big conversation. And the way I view it anyway is we need something more emergent than what we've got already. We can develop standards from the top down. There's value in that for sure. But the kind of complexity we're dealing with now, I mean, you got to understand data is the building blocks of what is basically a new civilization. It's not something you can plan ahead on entirely. So as this system emerges from the bottom up and from the top down, we'll need to create spaces or platforms where the negotiation can go on. So it's a complicated problem.
No, and I appreciate that. And I guess, some of the remarks that you made, Daniel, on having that conversation, the need to have the conversation between different sectors is extremely important. Something that comes to my mind are organizations like the Digital Nations, who met just recently this week, as well as the United Nations. In June, for example, the UN published its roadmap for digital cooperation. It addresses a way forward for connectivity, digital rights, inclusion, AI, trust and security, all of which has been slightly touched on by all three of you. Before I go into the next question for our panelists, I do definitely want to welcome questions early from our audience. Please take the time, enter your questions in the chat, and we'll be sure to keep an eye out for those questions coming in for our panel. And as we await those from the audience, I do want to touch on marketplace frameworks. Data governance was raised by Joni, and Chantal further elaborated. Daniel, you talked about this need for that conversation to occur between sectors, and the fact that it may not be as rosy as it could potentially be. So with that, as we can all attest, there are an array of policy instruments available to shape marketplace rules. We talked about standards. Chantal highlighted that, our co-chair Jim Basile as well in his opening remarks. Things also that come to mind are procurement, contracting, pricing, taxes, regulation, laws, treaties come to mind. So perhaps to start with, Chantal, where do these policy instruments intersect between public, private, and not-for-profit sectors? And of course, standards are an integral piece to shaping those marketplace rules. So if you could share with us a little bit about that intersection and how are these policy instruments today influencing market behaviors and governing data?
Thank you very much, Keith. Very also complicated question, but certainly the pandemic has accelerated a lot the shift to digital economy. We have changed our ways of consuming. Telework is the norm now since March, and we all expecting that there's going to be seamless service delivery. Certainly trust in the digital economy has been identified as a gap in Canada, and in response, again, the digital charter helps, and standardization is one of the cornerstone. Did you trust that you could join this virtual meeting today? Most likely yes, unless you had issues with bandwidth. But this meeting would be absolutely impossible without collaboration of public, private, non-for-profit at the international level, without the standards that have been developed jointly by ISO, IEC, and ITU for video compression. There is trust that we're going to be able to have this virtual meeting because there are standards. And I think another important element that needs to be considered is to increase trust and is confirmation of conformity. So making sure that those standards are complied with. Certainly the development of new standards and certification of a range of digital services within the standardization system that can and will provide is pivotal to support the Charter. And because this is an essential part of the puzzle, the Standards Council of Canada has launched in 2019 a very important collaboration area, the Data Governance Standardization Collaborative. The work that we're doing is based on life cycle assessment of data governance, from collection to use, commercialization, and we are very close to delivering a very comprehensive and consensus-based roadmap that will describe the desired landscape when it comes to Canadian standardization, including recommendations where there are gaps and new areas. We have, and Joni is part of this, we have looked at very interesting use cases to try to identify and well understand the issues, and we have done it from a perspective of very broad perspective, users, consumers, developers, technology owners, so that we intersect those perspectives and that we can, with confidence, provide recommendations of where we need to work and what is key. Another important element is with all this data and the tools like AI, we need to transform them, we need to evolve them, and especially verify the data sets that are being used for AI. So we are developing a prototype of conformity assessment to provide transparency and quality assurance to businesses and the federal regulators. The tools to ensure that when you're using AI, you can rely on it. So that's certainly, and I think, interesting initiatives where there is that connection of public, private, and non-for-profit interest perspective, so that we provide relevant standards and solutions going forward.
And to pick up on that as well, Daniel, standards do play a critical role. There are international, national standards that are in development right now, and the roadmap that Chantal speaks of in terms of what's that future landscape, what are we looking for, where's consensus between public, non-for-profit, consumer interests, and within industry. So, Daniel, in terms of the other types of ways to shape or policy instruments that are available as well to influence market behaviors, what are you seeing as perhaps gaps, or what instruments are you finding that are being used most in governing data?
Well, let me reframe the question slightly. I would say that what we're looking at is a transition in which data is more, as Jim pointed out, is more and more part of the trade system that is overarching across the world. And so institutions like the World Trade Organization are wrestling with how to manage this. And I think there's a need for something else, something at that scale. I don't think that this will be resolved in small incremental ways. I think we're going to need something like a large capital intensive effort to build institutions that can adapt to this. And so something along the lines of a World Data Organization would be valuable. Something at the scale of what was thought about at the end of World War II in terms of managing a transition of this scope. I mean, what we're talking about is a massive shift. And so it's clearly valuable at the local level to have the right standards at the federal level in Canada, in terms of Canada, and maybe across markets. But we have to consider that frictions are growing between regions of the world simply because there are no rules to manage this effectively. The regulation's not quite there. And so, when there's that kind of friction, it leads to flashpoints. So I think we need to be thinking at multiple levels. And, whatever tool sets, can be applied are useful. But a lot of it is going to be just discussions between regulators, legislators, legal professionals, tech developers, data scientists. I mean, getting data right's not easy simply because it feeds into artificial intelligence. It feeds into machine learning. It feeds into systems that are reconstructing our economy. And you need that. Data's a feedstock. It feeds algorithms which transform how our systems operate, right? We're in transition to a highly automated system. And so we're going to need new institutions. So I don't know if that helped with the answer, but.
No, that's great. And it reminds me of Michelle Girard, who's going to be joining us later on in a panel around IoT cybersecurity, is actually published a policy brief through CG on this notion of, to what you're describing, the move when the financial crisis hit around a financial stability board being required for this coordination across different economies. And in turn, is it something now where the call to action is setting up a digital stability board and being able to govern the data? So that very, very spot on points for sure. And certainly perhaps a call to action for folks and within our audience in terms of setting up that type of digital collaboration across different jurisdictions. And so turning to jurisdictions then, and the fact that there are different jurisdictions, Joni, for you, different jurisdictions may pull different policy levers at different times, both here at home and abroad. And how does that impact digital cooperation across jurisdictions?
Yeah, exactly. And I would say, we're, on the policy instrument side, we're not where we need to be as Canada in a Canadian context. And that is why also the work that's happening at the Standards Council of Canada on the Data Governance Collaborative is so important in informing how the digital charter is implemented. One of the things that, through that use case exercise that we've been doing with the Standards Council of Canada and through the learning that we have through publishing the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework on focused on digital identity, is that, we don't have the policy that we need. And so we've just published a 5-year strategy. And one of the things that we called out is that the important work that's happening at Standards Council of Canada to review the standards landscape is very informative. We need to also map in a legal review, and that legal review has to happen both in terms of enabling policy as well as in terms of policy barriers that exist at the federal level as well as at the provincial level. In the Standards Council of Canada Data Governance Collective, we've been looking at the intersection of digital identity and consumer-directed finance. And one of the things we notice there is that the finance space is federally regulated, whereas the digital identity space is largely one of those issues that it arises from confederation. Your legal identity comes from the provinces, unless you're an immigrant, in which case it comes from the federal government. So that's another place where cooperation is absolutely needed across the jurisdictions. And there is a layer of federal regulation that's going to be required, but that has to respect and work with different provincial regulation that does need to work in terms of the provincial sovereignty and the role that provinces are playing as those legal instantiators for digital identity. So there is absolutely work to be done in that space. We have a lot of foundational work that's been done through standards development, through the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, but we need to get there. And the other piece that I'll note here is around Canada's digital charter. Privacy and personal data protection, I would say, is a core Canadian value. We're respected for that around the world. We are quite advanced in that space. What we haven't seen shown up there is data empowerment, empowering people around how they use and how data about them is verified. And I think you heard Mark talk about that a little bit, is that empowerment piece is certainly going to open up a whole new set of unintended consequences as well as wonderful benefits. So we have to go into that empowerment space. We have to make sure that Canadians are empowered to make decisions about data about them. But we have to go into that, eyes wide open in terms of the benefits as well as the potential risks that opens up. And we need good policy at the provincial and federal levels to guide that.
Yeah, I think what you also raise around standards review, a legal review around where potentially some of these policy barriers are hitting us. What comes to mind as well is you mentioned the strategy within DIAC that's been developed, and as well, I find that there's a convergence that's happening within Canada around some core pillars to digital enablement. We heard it from Mark as part of his opening remarks on the national blueprint that the council has developed and published, of which digital identity is a core fundamental foundational piece that needs to be addressed. And you highlight that Confederation requires that we collaborate across different jurisdictions, and so perhaps again a call to action to continue that collaboration. I think the convergence there, the will is there. I've been quite excited to hear as part of the Digital Nations and Minister Murray's remarks in participating in that forum, and how things like data interoperability, digital ID, data sharing across different sectors of the economy are all hot topics that are pressing digital policy areas of today that are affecting all very, very advanced digital nations, and Canada is a key part in helping to solve many of those challenges. And so perhaps to all three of you, when we talk about new and existing forms of multi-stakeholder collaboration around data and digital technologies, could you share with us some areas that are showing great promise around this? Certainly, I'm quite ecstatic and excited to see Digital Nations in Canada hosting this year, and the types of discussions that are happening there to ensure we're learning from one another across jurisdictions and being able to advance data and digital technologies and for public good, for good for all. And I guess the question to all of you is: are there forms like this that you're finding are quite promising, and are there any limitations that you find as part of these groups when they're organized in making further progress? Perhaps Daniel, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So the World Legal Summit hosts a biannual summits every 2 years, in which we bring together cities from around the world to operate locally and to build a discussion at the local level around regulation and local jurisdiction among legal professionals, data analysts, and other professionals. And our expectation is that in doing this over time, we'll be able to convert some of this information and intelligence into actionable procedures that can be deployed by government, right, or the private sector. But the point being that the way we view it, what we're seeing is this confederation of systems that's emerging around similar problems, but solving them uniquely, differently. And so there's value in different cities or different jurisdictions learning from each other. The challenge is how to mediate that conversation. So what we tried to do is, so in 2019, we hosted 30 cities across 20 countries over roughly the same period, 24, 48 hours. and then attempt to now distill all that into some level of documentation that can have value. But as we understand it, the transition is away in many ways from centralized institutions and towards a more distributed, network-driven era. And so you see this in the way Trump, for example, leverages social media. I mean, we need to find a way to leverage networks to do policy that are complementary to government and complementary to other institutions, but in some respects can accelerate the process of adapting to technology, because as it stands, technology is simply moving too fast for centralized institutions to oversee. And so as we look at it, what we're looking at is such a massive transition towards networks that we're going to need to provide platforms essentially that allow for coordination across nodes. So that's what we're trying to do.
And Chantal, from your perspective, are you seeing particular limitations in how various standards groups are perhaps organized in making progress around these critical areas?
Limitation. I think there's certainly an evolution that is happening as we speak. I think the need that we need the need to access networks better that Danielle described, I think is right on the dot. And I think more and more the standards development organizations are working collaboratively. Their space of expertise is overlapping because of this the development of the technology. And just because I guess I'm an engineer and I think a lot about how do you implement this. Certainly one of the limitations in terms of from the standardization perspective is not forgetting the very important piece that we call conformity assessment. So standards are great, they help principles, but if we want to develop that trust in the digital economy and the tools that we use, we need to underpin it with conformity assessment. 80% of the world trade is supported by standards and conformity assessment. And I think that's an aspect that we need to consider from the get-go. So that would be, I think, one of the potential, not necessarily a limitation, but certainly a consideration not to leave behind at the end, but think about how we're going to implement this and what are the best tools to do that.
No, that's great, and you highlight the notion of conformity assessment. What are the trust signals in the marketplace that in fact influence behaviors? And I think Joni, as well as within DIAC and within the CIO Strategy Council as well, there's been lots of conversation around this on how do you effectively ensure or provide that confidence in the marketplace that when it comes to digital technologies or the way in which data is consumed and governed, that we can inherently trust it. Perhaps Joni, a question for you over, what are the sort of conversations happening around this topic of ensuring that the right trust signals are in the market and that we can actually trust those signals? And what does that look like in terms of collaboration between different sectors?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of collaborations that are happening here. I think, a little bit on that cross-jurisdictional discussion that we also had. I think looking at the Joint Councils of Canada, all the public sector CIOs and service delivery leads, that's another important body in terms of these different bodies that are collaborating. The trust signals are very important, and whether you're developing a framework or a standard, having that right signal and having that signal, having clarity around that signal, what that signal is going to be communicating. And so one of the things, that we're focused on with the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework is actually now testing that across both public and private sectors to make sure that it's behaving as it should be behaving and that it's providing value as it should in that cross-sector ecosystem, and making sure that that mark provides a signal both to entities to recognize each other, or determining if that's the kind of signal that would be sent that citizens and consumers would recognize, like that little lock in your browser. Those kinds of signals are very important, and then having the right frameworks to ensure that that those kinds of trust marks having recognition across those different marks. And so we're not asking organizations to continually jump through 17 flaming hoops to get to the place. And that comes back to your point about collaboration and cooperation. So if we have an ecosystem of these very targeted sector specific or function specific trust marks, we have to make sure that we do also have collaboration there so that we have the right level of verification to enable that trust, and that we also have something that's achievable that the ecosystem can participate in and they have an on-ramp to do so, and that we have cross recognition across those programs as well. So it's a little bit of a turtles all the way down. These are complex topics. If they were easy, they would be solved already, and that's why we're really thankful to have so many great groups, including those on the call and others who are not in this session, working on these really important problems, both for Canada and how we do this across the digital ecosystem, digital economy.
Well, that's great. And it's the call out there is, how do we effectively recognize across different sectors and across the public, private, and not-for-profit groups that these are the appropriate trust signals and these are the recognized standards, and then creating that overarching ecosystem. All is very good. Recognizing and be cognizant of time. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to give each of you sort of a 30-second blitz here. We've talked about a lot of challenges, some opportunity areas. Perhaps to conclude, what decisive action would you give our audience, critical factors, policies, standards that are needed to effectively govern data across public, private, and not-for-profit sectors? So what is that call to action? You have hundreds, thousands of people listening in, and many different groups. So what would your call to action be? What are those critical factors? What are those policies? What are those standards? So Joni, we'll start with you, David, and then Chantal, you'll have the final word. If we can limit to about 30 seconds each, that'd be great.
Yeah, there's lots of great work happening in the space. I would encourage you to review the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. I would encourage you to see where that applies. I would encourage you to tell us what kinds of problems you're trying to solve, and we'll tell you where the identity piece is in that and where the assurance is needed in those transactions. And I would encourage you to just get involved, contact us, contact any of the organizations that are represented here to be a part of this conversation.
David? Or Daniel, sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, so I'll pitch my organization quickly and just say, please reach out to us as well. We're trying to extend our tentacles and be a larger, more comprehensive organization. Having said that, I also want to just sort of make a point too that I think we have to start rethinking how government works as an institution, right? Our governments have been inherited from the industrial age, and they tend to be something like in the academy in the sense of being very ivory tower organizations. And that's not going to work in this era, right? And so what we're going to need is, these phrases, government as a service, government as an open network, open source government, digital government. All of these things are part of a process of rethinking self-governance in democracies. And so I think democracy as an institution is really struggling now. And part of it is because our governments are not as responsive as they need to be. Right? The private sector has democratized the market, even as it swallows data, and our governments haven't been as responsive. And so we're going to need to rethink government, and part of that is going to be about bringing citizens in more, into the systems to make decisions as agents. And that'll also involve using simulations and AI and obviously data standards, but it's a big problem. So that's something we'll have to explore.
Chantal, 30 seconds or less.
Okay, so I believe there's already tools at our disposal. They're called standards and conformity assessment. So I would please ask you to get involved at the national level and also at the international level. And please keep an eye on the data governance standardization roadmap that is going to come out. We need your views. We need your distribution of this information so we can create for Canada and Canadians the right standardization tools going forward to support this the digital economy. That's it for me.
That's great. So Chantal, Joni, and Daniel, it's been a pleasure having this conversation. And as a final word to our audience, this is a start of a conversation. We're grateful of Forward 50 and the platform they provided. There is, as a final word before I close our panel here, I encourage everyone attending today to join me and members of the CIO Strategy Council in the CIO Strategy Room at 4:30 today for an open discussion tying together the day's content and what's next for public-private cooperation around standards, AI ethics, data protection, IoT, cybersecurity, and more. So really, this is a primer, if you will, in terms of a very interactive discussion we can have later on today at 4:30 as part of the CIO strategy room, where we can effectively work through some of these critical challenges and address them and come up with real practical steps that we can all take together within our respective organizations across our respective sectors to further digital cooperation for Canada and abroad. Thank you again, panelists.
Thank you.
Well,
Bye,
thank you, Keith.
everybody.
Thank you.